This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 271 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with anti-diet, eating disorder recovery mentor, fat activist, and video content creator Daph Levy about her journey from being a quote-unquote dieting success story and weight loss camp counselor to pursuing a career in eating disorder treatment and recovery. We also talk about privilege in the eating disorder treatment field, the feeling of not belonging and dieting to try to fit in, sitting with discomfort in recovery, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. It's a really good one. And I just want to give a little content warning for it because Daph talks about some pretty recent struggles with disordered eating. And it's a great interview, so hopefully you'll bear with the bleeps. There's no Q&A segment this week because, as I shared in last week's episode, I'm working on my new book, and I'm winding down this podcast for a while with a full hiatus starting on March 15th so that I can devote more time to writing. But I'll still be doing the Q&As every week in my newsletter, so you can come subscribe at christyharrison.com/newsletter to make sure you get them. That's christyharrison.com/newsletter, and you'll get a special bonus Q&A right when you subscribe. And if you want to ask a question for me to answer in the newsletter, as always, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions, and that will automatically subscribe you to the newsletter as well. That's christyharrison.com/questions. Also, as I said last week, the podcast archives will continue to be here whenever you want to listen, and I'll be directing you to archival episodes in the newsletter as well. There is one podcast I'm going to keep doing consistently, though, and that is the one I do every month for my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course. So if you want to keep getting new audio episodes from me, even while I'm writing this new book, you can come join the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course, and there you'll get to ask your own questions every month and have me answer them in that special podcast, where I've also given hundreds of answers to other participants' questions already, and so you can listen to those and really work through all the nuances and little sticking points with intuitive eating and start to put it into practice in your own life. The course also has 13 modules of audio and written content teaching you the principles of intuitive eating in a self-paced way, plus a private community forum just for course participants so that you can have daily support from hundreds of other great people on this anti-diet path, as well as guidance from me and my team. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Daph Levy. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
One word that I use to describe it, and it's similar to what actually Bree said on her episode with you, is complicated. I think that word encapsulates a lot of how it feels. And while I have a hard time kind of remembering and accessing those memories of what it was like growing up and being around food, I certainly remember a lot of my feelings around it. For instance, I'm a daughter of two immigrants. My mom is from Argentina and my dad is from Israel. So both of them, immigrated to the United States at a fairly young age. My mom when she was a teenager, and my dad, I think likewise, or early adulthood. I notice as I reflect back that just like any immigrant family or immigrant coming to the country, I don't know anymore, but basically, this American dream people are just chasing. And I definitely think a way that my parents assimilated into this culture, specifically my mom, is to pursue the thin ideal. So messages that I heard around food is just like control what you eat, portion control, and then a lot of reference to, and then this would be in Spanish, but like, oh, at Argentina, that they don't eat like this. They just eat a piece of and that's when I knew I was doing, quote unquote, a good job. A dynamic that is super interesting to me, and I think is not uncommon in multi-generational homes, especially in the Latinx or Latina culture, is that my abuelita, my grandma, which I call her Abu for short, she played a huge role, first of all, it continues to, in my life. She grew up living with us. So I grew up in a household with my mom, my dad, my grandma, or abuelita, and my twin brother and my older sister and a dog. And I even, my first cousin is also kind of like a sister to me. And so we grew up in this household, and I just remember my grandma always welcoming us home from school with this elaborate meal. And it's so interesting that, like, I'd come home and it would be the smell of freshly grilled chicken with caramelized onions, or like with mashed potatoes, the fresh salad when you can just smell the lemon as well. Like I can smell it now even. And I was looking forward to it. At the time I was definitely ravenously hungry. It was interesting how like my grandma was so excited to cook for us and also acted as the food police for me and my mom specifically, and at times my sister before she moved away for college. So it's interesting that she would spend basically the entire morning and afternoon preparing foods. And then as I engaged in dieting, our diet foods, and would make something completely separate for my brother and dad. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And so basically essentially I wasn't allowed in the kitchen. It was just, my mom always told me it's just better to stay away from the kitchen, that Abu needs control. Otherwise she'll go crazy. She'll be over your shoulder. So it's almost like my mom was giving me pointers on how to deal with her mom, and that my mom clearly did not want any part of the kitchen because that's how she was raised as well. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating that it's like it was her domain and that she was in charge of kind of everything, both the pleasure side of food and the policing side of food, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think on a broader scale, and I know folks across different cultures and ethnicities and races and things of that nature, across the board, food acts as everybody has a relationship to food. And then there's this like a strong ethnic component, especially for folks who maybe practice a certain religion or come from a different background, or just come from a background where food is kind of the center where it brings people together. I mean, that's what we learn in school. And yet there is this idea, and it just feels very much like my experience with food didn't really represent the Argentinian and Israeli component as much as I wish it would have, just because I was so obsessed with dieting and I was glued to it. So, of course, there were moments in time like holidays, and honestly, whenever my grandma just wanted to prepare foods, even if it wasn't quote unquote for me and it was for my brother or for my dad, or frankly, other family members who just weren't on a diet, those foods were really enjoyable. My grandma herself, she comes from Italian descent. So it's this beautiful mix of Argentinian cuisine, which is really just like meat. And it's called entrañas, the cut of steak. So always a lot of meat growing up. And then the Italian piece. And then on my dad's side, we would just go visit his brother, literally like a few blocks away, for the occasional Shabbat dinner, where my aunt would cook in a beautiful, elaborate meal. And yet I could feel eyes staring at my plate. So it's like, here's this food, finish the plate, but actually don't even touch it, or like don't eat too much of it. And then it's interesting because it's like, oh, you didn't try this. Like, and then, my aunt or my grandma would be offended. And I'm like, but you literally just told me to stop eating. So which one is it?
What mixed messaging? So all over the place.
Yeah. So I would say that. And from what I was told growing up, apparently I was a picky eater. And I don't find that hard to believe at all. I think that totally could be true. But in reality, a compassionate voice in my head tells me that it just sounds like I never really got my needs met consistently through food and otherwise.
How did that affect your relationship with food? Did you have any, reflecting back now, did you have any disordered eating at the time, other than the kind of maybe restrictive patterns that you fell into at school? And also your relationship with your body, how did that affect that?
Totally. That's a great question. Yeah, I would say for as far back as I can remember, I often joke and I say I came out of the womb dieting, because that's how vivid. I can't remember a time where food was just food and it was just pleasurable, or whatever a quote unquote normal eating is, or what it looks like. I'm still finding that. So my relationship to food was really influenced by my mom, just by observing her relationship to food. And it's actually something that we connected through. We were very connected, like my mom would tell me about the diet she was on, how she's feeling. And then I would start it with her, and it would be this kind of tag team, like accountability buddy. And then we'd both, like, first thing as we wake up, and body checking from a very, very young age, and then weighing myself ultimately. And that dictated how the day was going to be. That dictated how I felt about myself. And I know that was true for my mom. And I didn't think it was abnormal. I thought that was normal. That's the whole thing that took me by surprise throughout this whole process, is that everything that I experienced in my early life before moving away from college or experiencing something else just felt normal, because I lived and grew up in Beverly Hills, which I like to call diet culture capital. As you can imagine, I mean, diet culture is ubiquitous and it's invasive everywhere, even around the world, but especially in Beverly Hills. Like, it was just so common to restrict your eating that it was like so uncommon to like actually go out to eat and eat. Like, I just remember going out to eat and ordering a salad, or just like ordering a coffee and just getting something to go for a family member and just like not eating. Like, that's how common it really was. And I'm having a hard time explaining the moment from which, because it didn't happen overnight, meaning my internalization of the thin ideal and this pressure to be thin obviously didn't happen overnight. These are learned behaviors, learned patterns, just like they are for most people who have family members who struggle with the same things. But I definitely learned it. And it wasn't just from my mom. And I know today I'm able to hold so much compassion for both my parents. They just did the best they could with the tools they had. And in addition to that, of course, I was receiving messages that, I wasn't fast enough to play on my soccer team. I wasn't small enough to fit into these clothes or fit into my sister's clothes, or there was always these measurements that arbitrary things that I used to measure my success, quote unquote, when in reality, I was just measuring my body, so to speak, and see what I would fit into. But I never felt this sense of belonging. And that's something that I learned through Brene Brown's work a lot. So it's something I definitely want to touch on, of like, I just wanted to fit in. I really just wanted to fit in. And more importantly, I wanted to feel like that I fit in. And I wanted to feel like I belonged. And I never did. I never did until I was 15 and had begged my parents to go to this weight loss camp. And that's kind of where things kind of took off. I mean, I had, like I said, I had been dieting for literally at least, I know for sure, at least at 13 onward. I have a feeling I started earlier on, but yeah, I struggled with my mental health throughout my adolescence. I struggled with like depression and anxiety, and even engaged in some self-harm behaviors from a young age. And what I now learned was it was totally a cry for help, and just confusion and learning how to adapt and not knowing how to basically. But I remember begging. I like watching this movie where this weight loss camp about a weight loss camp. I don't remember what it was. And then I was begging my parents to go. And something that I didn't mention before that I do think is super important was how class and socioeconomic status plays a huge role in our life. Because the best way I can explain it is I lived a very privileged life. And when I was living in Beverly Hills, when I was growing up, it was very obvious and evident to me that we lived well beyond our means. Like money was always an issue. And we didn't let it, I guess, stop us from doing the things that other people were doing and doing the things that we thought would make us fit in as a family. And me fitting in, like, for instance, living in Beverly Hills, the sacrifices my family had to make. So that would mean 6 of us living in a 2-bedroom apartment, and not in the hills of Beverly Hills, but just in a normal part of Beverly Hills. Believe it or not, there's actually regular apartments.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Yeah, and in reality, that is the sacrifice my family took to get that zip code to be eligible to go to Beverly Hills High School. So that's just one example of the sacrifices my family took, particularly my parents, to help us fit in. They just wanted to build us a life and set us up for success. I always knew the messages I grew up with, like, if you're educated, you will make money. If you're thin, you will be happy. You'll find a boyfriend. You will get married. And like these are the secret ingredients that you need. And then you will be happy. So that was always a message. Yeah, that was always the message I kind of grew up hearing.
It's interesting to me. Like, I'm just thinking as you're talking about the Beverly Hills piece and like making all these sacrifices to live there. It wasn't that sort of clear cut of an experience. But when I was growing up, we were definitely like some of the poorer people in a rich town, you know?
Yeah, totally. That's us.
Even though it was like we were very privileged, and also we were not, it was very clear the difference between me and other kids who had so many other things, who could afford like the name brand stuff all the time. I learned later in school for public health, it matters certainly what part of the socioeconomic scale you're on, sort of in absolute terms, but it also matters where you fall in comparison to your peers on that part of the socioeconomic ladder, meaning like if you are, in the upper middle class or whatever it is, but there's people in your community around you who have so much more than you do, and it's obvious, that actually affects your health and well-being. Like that affects people's mental health, that affects people's physical health as well, to have that sort of obvious discrepancy. And I thought that was so interesting because like when I grew up and started like thinking about social justice in college and stuff, I was always like, I'm privileged. I have this privileged background. Like, why do I feel so, there was a part of me that was like, but I don't really feel that. I don't really identify with that. And learning about that research later on made a lot of sense to me because I felt like that discrepancy between our family and the other families in this rich place was very, very obvious to me and made me feel left out or like I didn't belong.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Christy, because that's actually exactly how I felt and continue to feel, of like, I know I'm privileged and I know that we don't have X, Y, or Z. And it was just obvious. Like you said, it was obvious what we did and didn't have. And I can totally share experiences. Like I often describe or tell folks like, oh, what was it like living in Beverly Hills? I'm like, well, a common thing to do after school is just to, I don't know, like get your car or BMW like customized or whatever. Like who knows? So one thing that kind of encapsulates what the discrepancy was like if you compare the parking lot of the teachers at Beverly Hills High School to the parking lot of the students at Beverly Hills High School, the students' parking lot was filled with, Mercedes Benz, BMW, Porsches, all of the fancy cars, basically. And they were all, either their parents' cars until, of course, they were 16, and then they got their own cars. And then, you compare it to the teachers' parking lot where you would see more traditional, like middle class cars, like, Toyota SUVs or pickup trucks or just regular sedans, things of that nature, like Honda, Toyota, and things like that. Just to kind of circle back to that, my experience, it's like that was totally one of the sacrifices my family took. My dad was researching for months. When we were 16, there was like this pressure to just immediately get your driver's license and immediately have a car. That totally was one of those things that my dad and my parents didn't want my brother and I to feel left out on. And so while I was totally happy looking at a super like used Jeep or literally a minivan. I don't know. A minivan was my dream car because I was thinking about all the features in a minivan.
That was my first car.
Yeah.
Was my parents' old minivan.
Like I love the idea to this day, like the swivel chairs, the armrest, the DVD players, the automatic doors. Like it just seemed so high tech to me. And yet my brother was like, no, we're getting a BMW. And my dad he's so charming and so is such a great salesman and negotiator that he was able to get a really good deal on a used BMW. And that's what my brother and I drove. I mean, ultimately my brother, and then I dated this guy that ultimately we did everything together. So I was just always riding around with my boyfriend at the time and his Mercedes Benz and Porsche and things like that. So that is just a little snippet of like a sacrifice that my family took or a decision they made, really. And it's interesting. One other piece that is just like, oh my gosh, that is so Beverly Hills is that for a sweet 16, or I don't know, actually it might have been like 18th birthdays, where like it was so common for folks who had their birthday, the main gift that they would receive is a nose job. So you would, yeah.
Wow.
So they would be out of classes for like a couple of days to a week and then would come back with like bandages on their nose. And it was just, it was so common.
It reminds me of Clueless. Was Clueless at Beverly Hills High? I feel like it might have been.
I wouldn't doubt it. I don't doubt it. But like, that's the kind of stuff that I'm just like, seriously? Like, obviously you think back and I'm just like, holy shit. Like these folks live in a bubble. And so before I could actually find the language to describe those public health issues and more of that like social justice language, it was really just, I was just always explained my story as, oh yes, I grew up with different values. My mom and dad raised me with different values than those around me. But in reality, it sounds like the folks that I grew up with have similar values, but had access to fulfilling them and living by them. And ultimately, I know like at the end of the day, my mom and dad knew they would have made it. And my mom feels like she made it. She tells me to this day because she was able to help us go through college, whether that means, luckily my sister is brilliant and got a full ride to Yale. So I joke and say it's almost as if she didn't exist in terms of financially, just fully cover tuition, room and board, all of it to Yale. And then my brother and I wanted to go to college, of course. And the idea of staying in California, let alone LA, but California even was too close. I was like, I need to get out of here. But going back even before that, because I'm now approaching like end of high school, really just going back to kind of freshman year of high school is when another sacrifice my family took was saving up money, or I don't even know how they made it work, but basically they had to like pull $6,000 out from who knows where to send me to this weight loss camp. Because I begged them. I was like, I need to go. I have to. This is the only thing that will make me happy. I've tried every diet under the sun. I can't do this alone. I don't want to do this here. I just need to go away. I need space. And so I remember going, checking it out. And it was actually the first year that camp had opened up at that place in California next to beautiful wineries. It was located at a private school, boarding school campus. And I know we don't really, obviously you're going to bleep out the numbers, but just from a dietetics perspective and knowing, weight loss, like I'm just going to share that, you can just bleep it out. But I lost pounds in 4 weeks.
Jeez.
I was 15, and this was already after I had lost some weight. And I remember, every week there would be a weigh-in. They did all the measurements. I still remember to this day what I weighed going in and what I weighed going out, leaving camp. I actually made a montage, literally what we would call now like a vision board or like a storyboard of camp. I printed out all the photos. I glued my weigh-in chart as a token of my achievement. And, I was welcomed home with posters by my brother, like, keep going, you're doing great. And just all of that validation that I needed, that I so desperately needed and wanted, the love that I needed and wanted that I honestly hadn't felt until I started taking my weight loss journey seriously, basically, and started seeing results, and then from that point on, it felt very much like, all right, how are we going to help Daphne keep this off and keep losing the weight? And ultimately, that would look like hiding food from me and not keeping things in the house and just like outwardly shaming foods, just kind of, the typical disordered eater, I guess. Now it was just the norm, and it's what we had to do to continue losing weight. And I was the success story because I actually kept losing weight. I kept it off. And actually the only thing that weight loss camp taught me was how to use a famous calorie tracker. So I eventually just, after camp, all I did was just log every single thing I ate, skipped a lot of important nutrients that I needed as a little teenager. And I tried to eat as little as I can. I remember trying to go from like to calories a day.
Wow.
I tried my best.
That's ridiculously low. That's like major starvation.
Major. I mean, I don't know if I think I put it that low and I never hit it that low. It was always like a little bit above. And that's what ultimately that's what served as my quote unquote motivation to keep going. When in reality, it was just shame. It was just shame that kept me stuck in that place. But how it felt was motivation. So it's really interesting. That's the seductive nature of dieting. It's like, oh, I failed. I didn't hit the calorie mark. I ate calories. So tomorrow I can't have this. And what was I going to do to compensate? So knowing what we both know now, like I very much was, as a result, very preoccupied with everything I was and wasn't eating. I wasn't so concerned with movement as I didn't really enjoy it. I was a part of the soccer team again, but I wasn't truly a part of the team. I was always behind. I was always last. I never wore shorts. I always wore sweatpants to literally soccer practice in LA. Like, what? I was just embarrassed to be in my body, and I was still receiving such positive reinforcement and praise for the job that I was doing. And I ultimately lost about pounds total and kept it off. That was the piece that was really hard to, and I still, when I was on my journey and as I was on my journey to unlearn these things, I couldn't fathom an idea that like, I am not my weight loss. Like, what are you talking about? I worked so hard to lose all this weight and I kept it off. Like, I am the success story. I'm in that top 5%. I know 95% of diets don't work, but it worked for me. I'm finally at a normal weight. I'm not like super skinny and I'm not fat, but I'm like, I mean, I also struggled with like major body dysmorphia. So I thought I was still the same size I was before camp. But anyway, yeah, so there was clearly this huge disconnect. And that's when I also realized I was looking back, like I was really sick growing up. And I also know that everything going on around me, so that financial piece, my mental health was plummeted. Just not having enough physical space in a home takes a toll on you. Consistently not feeling like you belong and you're not good enough. And my only purpose in life was to lose weight. And that's it. I couldn't think of anything else. I didn't have that capacity.
This reminds me of The Life Thief. When you were talking about all of that, that just kept popping into my head, that your life was so stolen by these years of dieting. Like the image of, playing soccer in sweatpants all the time in LA heat, like, it's robbing you of like the pleasure of the wind on your skin even, or like the feeling of, your body being the right temperature when you're doing that activity. Like from things that small to like, yeah, just your whole childhood sort of circling around this weight loss and not feeling like you belong until that happens. I mean, that's the thing that people don't talk about when they talk about quote unquote success stories with weight loss, right? And I think all of the people I've talked to on this podcast who were those success stories, of whom you are now the third in like, 275 episodes by this point?
Oh my goodness.
Right? So it's like a tiny percentage.
Wow.
And of course, this is not a representative sample either, but it is like 5 or less % of people are those quote unquote success stories. But the stories that I hear from, and I've talked to people like clients who were too, but again and again, what I hear from people who were those quote unquote success stories is that it just took over their life, that they did not have a life outside of the pursuit of weight loss. And it was like, talking about how you would wake up every day and it would kind of organize your day. It's like, that's what it is for the people who are those unicorns. Basically it's an eating disorder. It's severely disordered eating. So I'm curious for you, like how you started to recognize that your life had been stolen in that way, or how because you've been to treatment, you're in recovery, you're like doing this anti-diet work. So I'm really curious how that switch started to happen for you.
Absolutely. That's a great segue. And one piece that I kind of want to mention before I kind of close that chapter, but played a huge role in this was that, that experience. So post weight loss camp, and then I continued to lose weight throughout high school, and I wasn't popular by any means, but I felt like that was the only way to achieve any sort of social status or any success. And ultimately, I ended up selecting to go to the University of Vermont. So as far away, as opposite as you can imagine from LA. But again, I didn't know that at the time. I just chose it because it looked pretty and because it was far away. And that's it. It's just like a beautiful metaphor, basically. But anyway, I remember in college, so my freshman year, first of all, talk about culture shock, like I had just mentioned. Like I'm going from a place like LA to Vermont where pronouns are a thing. I didn't even know what part of speech that was, like grammatically. I wasn't introduced to that concept until college. And so part of that like freshman greeting and orientation, I mean, like, what are your pronouns? I'm like, what are yours? Like, what's a pronoun? Like, can you remind me? So yeah, it's like writing that down. So that's just an example of the culture shock and just like how, I guess the word I would describe what I saw, like what people looked like, they were just androgynous and they were just so unapologetically themselves. Different hair color, different size bodies, couldn't tell / I was so curious about their gender, and I was, I guess, taken aback by the fact that I guess I quote unquote couldn't tell what their gender was, even though now I know it doesn't have a look, but I didn't know that at the time. So these were just a part of this culture shock. And I'm like, what the hell am I doing in Vermont? And this isn't even like winter yet. This is like summer. Anyway, so freshman year, I was studying elementary education, and I did a great job. I actually finished like the top of my class. I was like literally at the highest GPA you can have. So, and that was consistent. I was a consistent top performer in school. And so like that's also consistent with eating disorders, just the perfectionism. But I wasn't fulfilled. I was like, well, I don't care. Like, I hate to say it this way, but the way I describe the moment in which I knew I had to just leave education was that people just had such remarkable stories of specific moments in time that they shared with their teacher that played such a huge role in their life. And then I'm thinking like, I'm sorry, but I don't want to teach like young kids about volcanoes or like teach young kids things like, I don't know. I don't want to be in a classroom setting is basically what I came to the realization. And also I didn't have that experience. I hated school. I absolutely hated it. I didn't have that special relationship. So long story short, I was like, well, I know a lot about nutrition. I'm really good at it, whatever the hell that meant. I've been able to lose all this weight and keep it off. And I know everyone around me probably wants to know the same thing. And I want to help people. So what should I do? Okay, think about nutrition. So met with the advisor, ultimately decided to move forward with studying nutrition. I was already a semester behind. So I had to like catch up and do a few semesters of like full credit, full load with like chemistry, biochem, anatomy, all those classes. And that's when things started unraveling for me, because the summer of freshman year of college going into sophomore year, and then the summer after that, so the first 2 summers of college, freshman and sophomore year, I actually, that's when as soon as I had the thought, yes, I want to pursue nutrition, I was like, okay, well, I need a summer job. Immediately I applied to the weight loss camp as a counselor, but not the one in LA or California, the one that like is actually where it all started up in upstate New York. So it was closer to Vermont. So it wouldn't be such a big trip. And experiencing that and going through that experience, in hindsight, I was so sick. I was so sick until about when I started junior year. That's when recovery really started for me. So basically, when I decided to start studying nutrition, my first action or the first thing I wanted to do was be a mentor and help people do what I did, basically. So I applied to work at the weight loss camp at New York. And essentially, in hindsight, what this camp was basically eating disorder camp. I don't know how else to describe it. We were all eating the same amount. And we were all like, the population consisted of kids as young as 7-year-old girls all the way up to 18-year-old boys. So like very, very much adolescent teenage years. And me as a counselor, I just remember spending my entire freshman year thinking like, okay, I have to be thin. Like they need to look up to me. And in reality, I just spent the entire summer really focusing on myself and my journey. Like it was just an opportunity for me to perpetuate my eating disorder. And that I convinced myself that I was setting an example. So that means like the schedule at a weight loss camp basically is you're working out all day, and the breaks that you have would be like lunchtime and just kind of in the evening. That's more like camp style vibes. So that was honestly fun, like connecting with your peers and just playing fun camp games. Like there were certainly community aspects that I felt like I belonged because everyone there was fat. Everyone there was fat, and it wasn't this elephant in the room. And as I think back to college essays, I'm like, yeah, I described it as we could explore our identities outside of our weight, when in reality, that's just what brought us all together. We were all striving to be thin. We were all struggling we were all honestly struggling with eating disorders. But the crazy part is that, now with the training that I have now, realizing that none of this was advised through a dietitian or supervised through a dietitian or therapist for that matter. It was literally like the owners of the camp. And I ultimately helped run nutrition classes. Mind you, I didn't have any experience in nutrition at the time. I took one class, I think, but I was helping people. I was spreading messages about diet culture. I was like, here's how to like limit your portions. Here's what's good, what's bad. And I was literally teaching young folks how to do this. And it wasn't until the second year, so the second time I went to be a counselor, that's a summer where I had reached my lowest weight. And that's because I was determined to, again, I was kind of focusing on myself while also trying to convincing myself that I was setting an example. So I would like sneak into the weight room like whenever I can, because obviously as a camp counselor, like I have a job to do, right? But I was taking every free opportunity in addition to participating in the exercises with those kids to actually get in a workout, to get into this specific high intensity workout, and eating and I had access to all of the nutrition guidelines, and the calories were like nothing more than a day, but we were working out at least hours a day.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point, is to be physically active and not eat a lot.
Right.
So I'm like, I don't even know if you open the DSM-5, it's like literally bulimia camp. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's eating disorder camp. So that's when I remember specifically, I was thin and I know I'm not fat, but why am I so unhappy? Why am I crying all the time? I'm literally like doing what I thought I want to do. Like, I'm doing great. Why am I so miserable? I remember myself specifically standing in the gazebo at camp, crying, thinking to myself, like, what the hell is wrong with me?
You were starving.
I was literally fucking starving.
Like, you were starving and your mental health was suffering. Ugh.
So that was the turning point where I was like, something's wrong with me.
Did you seek out therapy after that?
Yep. So typically in college, specifically dietetics, like you have to have, in addition to taking the prereqs, you also have to have a practicum experience. So practicum experience is literally just like an internship, like any old internship that you get experience that you could just check off saying, oh, yep, you work, like you did something essentially. And that experience was at a local eating disorder center. And I felt really lucky because they were looking for an intern. I was looking for a place to intern. And I remember interviewing for that intern experience and telling the dietitian that I was going to be shadowing all the things that I did to keep my weight off and to be healthy. And I was really proud of it. And I noticed that she was writing it down. And I was like, it was interesting. I was like, Anyway, I say that to say, like, I ultimately ended up getting accepted for that internship. And that was like a turning point as well. In addition to the feeling like something's wrong with me, then things started to piece together. Like, oh, so people are calling this an eating disorder. Why is that? So it was really, I was shadowing this dietitian, and it was always in Tuesday mornings, which is when there were staff meetings. And I would always hear from all of the therapists and the psychiatrists. And so hearing from all of the providers talk about their clients and patients, I was like, oh, this is literally me.
So interesting. Those staff meetings are very eye-opening, I think, to a lot of people. I know it was for me too.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with something like eating disorders that is often accompanied by so many other diagnoses and comorbidities, right? Yeah, and ultimately patients that they were talking about died. That was a huge turning point. That semester, I started medication, I started therapy, and that's when I started recovery. And as I continued doing the education of nutrition, a friend of mine literally just like handed me her copy of Intuitive Eating and was like, here, read this. I think you'll love it. And I was like, cool, this looks like a new diet. Like, I'm excited. Let's do it. And we were literally in like biochem lab. She goes, I'm reading this book. I think you would love it. And the previous week she was telling me about keto.
Oh.
But like she
didn't know like what intuitive eating really was.
No, she didn't know. But then she started reading Intuitive Eating, and I was like, oh my God, I want to read this. So I started reading it. I was like, what the fuck is this? What are they talking about? And again, this is me. So this is my experience. So these were the pivotal experiences through college that ultimately, entering the dietetics field with the intention of wanting to help people lose weight, was still opening a door leading me to recovery in a strange way. because I had access to information and the back, and these messages where it was obviously, as you can imagine and probably experience, like the messages I was receiving, like I elected, one of my electives was this quote unquote O word class that I took. I don't even know what the rest of the name was, but I put myself in those situations, but in reality, it was like so normal. Like my friends were also counting calories too. My friends, they bring snacks to class, and of course, it's like, and I don't know, just a lot of, and of course, I spend time, like, instead of focusing on the class, like looking at what other people were eating and things like that. So
I'm curious how your recovery started then from there, because it sounds like you were still straddling the fence. You were
totally
introduced to these concepts of eating disorder recovery, which sounded hugely helpful. You got into therapy, you discovered the book Intuitive Eating, but you were also still like one foot in this weight management, quote unquote, side of things.
Yeah, because the message of eating disorder recovery was just coming from this book, whereas all of the other, I was surrounded by all these other messages that served as confirmation bias that like, no, intuitive eating wasn't like, it was this like, oh, this new idea that like literally nobody else had read that book. Like it wasn't like a common book. My friend just handed it to me and it wasn't anything that was ever brought up. So like I said, all the conversations and education and curriculum were around weight management and how to portion control and some tools that you can use to calorie count and what my plate and all that shit. So my recovery started when I remember specifically, when I was doing that internship and I started therapy. So my therapist was like, okay, girl, she's like, I think you need to try medication. So immediately I go to the school psychiatrist and I go on medication. And then I noticed, I'm like, oh, so I don't have to feel like I want to die every day. Really? Like, I was just like taken aback. Like, at that point, I knew it was working because I was really suicidal and I was, harming myself again. And that was an indication to me. I think previously in my life, like as a child, when I was engaging in those behaviors, I think it was more of a cry for help. But now in college, it was really, I need to externalize this excruciating pain that I'm in. I cannot stop crying. I don't know how the hell I'm able to go to class, but I managed to. And at that time, I'm counting my macros religiously. I'm engaging in what's quote unquote flexible dieting and reading all the books about that. And then reading intuitive eating and then doing the internship. And then one of the positions I had at school was a wellness associate at Living Well, which was like a clinic associated with the counseling center or the wellness center. It was actually really great. It's very sex positive. And that was when I started to learn more about eating disorders and substance abuse and addiction and resources that were super more aligned. So that's when the introduction of, and like I was surrounded by folks and professionals who were focusing on those things as well. So it felt like, okay, so I really like this mental health aspect. And then the recovery. So recovery did start junior year. So spring semester of junior year, I took this class called Understanding Eating Disorders, and I was floored at what I learned. That's when I actually learned what intuitive eating really was, what health at every size was, because the dietitian teaching it was phenomenal and was actually working. She was working with patients who struggled with binge eating disorder. And this was all in Vermont. So I was just shook that I was so surprised that there was even an eating disorder center and there were dietitians. Like I was just like this little state, the internship I had, there wasn't any other eating disorder center in the state. Like that was it. And this class, I have never heard of that. And it's just so crazy to me that in general, education around eating disorders is so uncommon. And then again, and especially for a little state or a college like UVM, where it's in the middle of nowhere, you know what I mean? That's what I was surprised by.
It's pretty amazing that you had those resources there.
I had amazing resources, not only with my work study job at Living Well, but also that's where I learned a lot about like sex positivity and more so about like sexuality and stuff. And also just being at UVM, the culture, and then learning about eating disorders. And that's when I knew I was like, okay, this is what I want to do 100%, but I'm struggling with this. So that's when I was grappling with like, okay, I'm done with the like weight loss. I really, really know that I need to just like focus on eating disorder recovery. This is what I want to help people do. So I remember the next year, senior year, I actually was asked to be the TA for that class. So I became a TA for that. And then I also just saw an email newsletter from the National Eating Disorder Association about, or at the time, Binge Eating Disorder Association, BEDA. And I applied for their scholarship to attend that BEDA conference in 2017.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool. We were in the same space.
Yeah. And I had no idea who you were. I had no idea who anybody was. I was just this little, senior in college, free trip to New York, staying with my sister for the weekend. I basically had to it was in the middle of finals. So I had to basically finish all my finals early in order to catch that flight. It was crazy, but I was determined because I was so passionate. I was like, I struggled with this. I want to do this. I found my passion. Here we are. So I attend Binge Eating Disorder Association, and that's actually where I met Kimmy Singh and Julie Duffy Dillon. So that was like my real introduction to health at every size and intuitive eating, and everything I know today is like that BEDA conference in 2017, specifically conversations with Julie and Kimmy and Beth Rosen. So yeah. And I remember, and I was applying for dietetic internships at that time. And I was like putting my feelers out there. At that time, Simmons was on my radar because it was the only other, there's two internships that like formally have eating disorder training. And that's one in Minnesota and then one here in Boston, Simmons. That's led by Marcy Evans and Lisa Pearl.
So good.
Yeah, so good. I didn't know who these people were. And at that time, I remember being introduced to Anna Sweeney. I was like, who is this person? But ultimately so I was like, okay, she seems friendly. And she actually introduced me to, I don't remember who, I think it was Lisa Pearl. And it was just crazy to me that I had no idea who I was talking to. It was wild, but that was like a huge, huge experience. That's when I was like, okay, I see. Like, this is what I need to do. But I was still struggling.
And you went to treatment at one point in there too, right?
Yeah. So I applied to Simmons, and listen, I mean, I didn't want to do the internship. I knew that I was still really struggling with my mental health. Ultimately, I ended up seeing one of the nutrition advisors, and she was like, you have a passion, like you need to go pursue this. Like, I really encourage you to do it. So I ultimately applied, and I got matched to Simmons. I remember that day specifically because it was my birthday. So I got matched to Simmons, and I was excited, but I was also kind of like, like, I'm tired. I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I don't want to be in school anymore, but I didn't have a choice. I felt like I didn't have a choice, and I had to choose either the master's program in addition to the dietetic internship if I wanted to be even considered for the eating disorder program. But I was like, I cannot afford this. Like, I already calculated all the student debt I was in. I had over $70,000 in debt. And this is like, I can't get a master's in this. I can't afford it. Not only that, but I also don't want a master's in nutrition. Like, it's just, I'm not at this point in time. I know exactly what I am passionate about in the field, but that's it. Everything else I'll leave. Like, I'll take what I want and I'll leave the rest. And it just felt like a waste. My gut was like, Daph, you're going to learn one way or another, because I know myself, and I love learning, and I love asking people questions, and I'm very resourceful. So I will learn about eating disorders one way or another. This isn't going to be the only chance to learn about it. So I'm so glad I talked myself down and it was just like, yep, just do the internship. So around that time in my life, so that summer spring, May 2018, I graduated college with a bachelor's of science in dietetics, nutrition, and food science from the University of Vermont. And I moved back to LA for the summer because I and now had to figure out arrangements to move to Boston. And basically that summer, it felt like my life fell apart. That's the summer my dad started abusing substances.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know that this was the struggle he'd had faced and that he had struggled with like throughout his life, even before knowing my mom. But it was a struggle that once I was home, I didn't realize. I had no idea. I didn't recognize him. I just remember one night, and I knew I was going to Boston. So I was like, okay, I'll just mind my own business. Like, I don't know what else to do. Was going on my birthright trip. I couldn't fathom anything else. I couldn't have any more things on my plate. At this point, I was questioning my sexuality. I was going on my birthright trip. And then 2 months later, I was moving to Boston. And I also just like luckily got this summer job at a brand new eating disorder private practice with the dietitian who was just starting her practice. And I literally just helped her build her practice basically from the ground up. I did a lot of the calling insurance companies and billing and admin and website, and did a lot of the things, like research a lot about S Corp versus LLC. So that's where I started learning a lot about business and the business of that. And I was like, okay, I can see myself doing this. Like, okay, cool. Dietitian in private practice, I got this. Like, I started to feel motivated, but I also was super depressed. And because my dad was abusing substances, he wouldn't come home some nights. He was like rail thin. Like, that's a common side effect of using substances. And I remember one night I was waiting for him. It was like 2 a.m. and he came home from, I don't know where, a bar or something. And he sat me down, and he clearly wasn't sober. And he looked at me, and I was like, Dad, where are you? Where were you? Like, I've been waiting for you. Like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? And he goes, Daphne, I'm so disappointed in you. You gained so much weight.
Oh,
He told me that.
Jesus.
Yeah. He was like, what happened to you? Like, I'm so upset. Why did you do this to yourself? Why did you let yourself go? And I started crying, or I tried to like swallow my tears basically. And I was like, this isn't about me. This is his stuff. He's not sober. But I still to this day, that's a moment I won't forget.
That is hugely painful.
I can feel it in my heart right now. It feels like my worst fear came true in that moment. That I let him down, that I let everyone down, that I let myself down. And when in reality, I was in recovery and exploring my sexuality and making huge strides in my career, setting myself up for success.
Doing better than ever and having your life start to become more full too.
Literally, I was excited about something that wasn't food. So I was dealing with that. And my entire internship, I was going through that traumatic experience. I remember almost fainting one time when I was in class and for my internship. I just like got very lightheaded, and I just had like a full-blown panic attack. And I actually took a month off in that internship because I physically couldn't be there. I was crying in the bathroom whenever I had a moment in between patients. I also like moved to Boston and then jumped into clinical. Like, my clinical rotation, like, it's, notoriously like the hardest one, and especially for an internship that is very heavily community based, because I knew I didn't want to do anything else. I knew with all my might in my heart, I just wanted to work with people who struggled with the same thing I did. And I knew that I just had to jump through these hoops. I knew that 9 months, it'll be done. I've done the 4 years. Look at all the things I've accomplished. I can do this. But I was having panic attacks in the bathroom. I was having trauma nightmares every single night, like not sleeping, not eating nearly enough. And then also just being in the internship where it was traumatic being bigger when everyone else around you was thin and white. I mean, I was white passing, so I didn't feel that marginalization, but I did it with my body. And again, I wouldn't identify I think I was small fat back then. So very much passable in terms, like, I had no issues thinking about going onto the bus and going to the rotation, but I very much was body conscious, like going into the internship of like, what are these dietitians going to think of me and things like that. And I just know that I noticed that like I wasn't retaining much of the clinical. I either didn't want to or I just couldn't. My brain was literally full. So I had to take time off. I went to a partial hospitalization program here in Boston just for mental health so that I can actually get access to medications. I also didn't have health insurance. I was trying to get on Mass Health. So there are these pieces. I was working with a dietitian who luckily was able to see me on a sliding scale for a few dollars for 30 minutes every other week. I was doing everything I can in addition to my internship to keep my recovery together. I identified as being in recovery, even though I didn't feel like I was sick enough to know that I had an eating disorder. But as I was doing my internship, I was like, no, I definitely I wasn't able to actually appreciate how bad it was until after my internship. After my internship, throughout the internship, I was really, again, setting myself up. I had access to amazing folks. I went to the Meta conference. I sought out opportunities and rotations to work with dietitians in private practices here locally in Boston. I did everything I could because that was the only thing I could see in front of me. And that was the only thing keeping me going. I remember specifically in my clinical rotation, the very first week, I was so overwhelmed, again, having panic attacks without health insurance, without medication, clearly not eating enough. And I still was like, okay, but I'm questioning my sexuality. And I had something else to focus on. I had my internship and I had my sexuality to explore. It was like a mission. One day I got a message when I was in my clinical rotation from my current partner who just messaged me, and we started texting, and then very much felt just heard. And I even told her what I was doing in school, even though it felt so chaotic. She was just so affirming and validating in my experience. And she was so willing to meet me where I was at in my sexual identity and my exploration phase. Because the last thing I wanted to do was make anybody I was going to get involved with an experiment. But it clearly was an experiment. I had no idea what I was doing. But long story short, we literally went on a first date, continued talking. And 2 weeks later, she was the person I called to pick me up from my clinical rotation after having a breakdown. And the next day, me getting admitted into the partial hospitalization. So I emphasize that point because she's the person that has been there through it with me every single step of the way. And I don't think I would have gotten through it without her. She in many ways saved my life. She's the one who actually gave me that resource to get evaluated and then ultimately admitted into that PHP program. So I met her 2 weeks later. I'm sure, poor thing, she didn't know what she was getting involved with, but we hit it off and we met each other where we were at, and she was just so willing to just be there. And that's when I knew that gender does not matter, sex does not matter. I need a partner like this. This is she showed me what I deserved and how she showed me and love and continues to love me the way I feel that I deserve and need. And I so clearly can compare it to previous relationships, which were all with men previously. But even just me in the relationship, I've never felt more fulfilled or more loved than I do now. And so that was the one positive thing keeping me through. Because at this point, the internship was so traumatic. I just wanted to get it done, even though I had jobs lined up and was so excited at the prospect of being an eating disorder dietitian, even though in my heart, I knew I wasn't ready. I took the exam, in August. I finished the internship in June. I had to make up the clinical rotation. And then, so I finished after everyone else. So tying back to the piece of feeling like I was last, but then I took the exam in August and I failed. And then after that, I got a job at Apple where I currently work because I needed to pay the bills. And things started to really take its toll. My body started to tell me, you need to deal with this now. Enough is enough. You need help. You need to be taken care of. So luckily with Apple even though it's a large corporation, I had amazing benefits. I've never had health insurance like that, but I was able to take off 12 weeks to go to eating disorder treatment.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. This was December 2019. So I started at the partial hospitalization program here in Boston. Then after 3.5 weeks, they were like, you need to go to residential. The program here in Boston honestly was phenomenal. It was really helpful. And I did not feel stigmatized at all. It was really interesting to be a part of. And then the going to residential, I just remember literally just like thinking to myself, like, I just wish I just wish somebody could be here to take care of me. And even though I had the best support from my girlfriend, what I ached for, what I longed for was the support of a mom and a dad.
Because you'd never had that. Like you'd never had their support in your relationship with food, really. It was always pushing you to diet.
Exactly. And that's what they thought was right, And at this time I knew I didn't have the capacity to teach my siblings or my mom or my dad was just MIA doing, whatever. But they weren't, it's not like they were in a place to actually hear what I was going through because they were all struggling through it themselves. So I literally just remember making the decision overnight. I took an overnight train to Philadelphia to go to residential. And it was a really dark time. I didn't feel as much stigmatized as it was just really the whole experience of being a patient when I was so hell bent on becoming a dietitian, an eating disorder dietitian. I felt so much shame about being a patient. And to this day, I still struggle in my own treatment with the feeling of shame as a result of like the resentment I feel or jealousy even of dietitians who just got it together. But in reality, I didn't have the privilege that the dietitians that I wanted to be had. I couldn't just do this as a side hustle like a lot of the dietitians were doing. I didn't have the privilege of having a second income in the household. I also didn't have family nearby. It was just me and two random roommates. And then ultimately now I live with my partner. But it was just, me and her, and that's it. It was just me, basically. So anything that I wanted to do, I had to do. I had to make it happen. And that was very clear. And that's to this day something I really still struggle with. So the compassionate part of me says that the system wasn't made for people like me. It never was. I wasn't meant to become a dietitian the way that the systems are set up. So just thinking about that, and I to this day think about, I still feel very much like I don't belong in this field because of how it's just so privileged. And it's just it feels so opposite of what my experience is. Like some of the responses, even though I have a foot in the door in terms of being connected via Facebook and stuff like that, reading about how other professionals help patients and clients do this phenomenal job. The questions that they ask are great, remarkable questions. But to me, sometimes the answer feels so obvious, or I have so many more questions because it just sounds like if they're not dealing with folks who have a certain level of privilege, it's almost like they don't know how to help people like me.
Is the field something that you still want to be a part of in order to provide that for other people? Or do you feel like you're just done at this point?
In my heart, I just know I want to help people like me. But if I do that, I will never make a living. I do not want to charge people like me in terms of financial like ability are worse off. Like I was paying like $20 a session. The sessions were like 30 minutes to see a dietitian, or $30. And that was still really hard. It was really hard to afford. And I was doing this all through my internship and going to physical therapy. So I was and having a therapist virtually and dietitian and doctors and things like that. So recovery is a full-time job in and of itself. And I'm not done in terms of being in the field professionally. I don't feel done at all. What I'm just trying to sit in this discomfort of not knowing, because that's ultimately the hardest part for me. It's not easy to say like, okay, just take the test, but just entertaining the idea that like, no, I have to be an RD, and it's so clear cut that almost is like too easy. And doesn't feel in alignment with who I am and what I value. What I value is being honest and helping people in the best way that I can, but not doing it at the expense of my health. So I just haven't figured that out yet. My partner and I just started a production company to help businesses share their messages with video and things like that. So technology and having an influence and sharing impactful messages is still something that is another passion of mine. So through recovery, at least I was able to identify that I have more than one passion. So for that, I'm grateful. But right now, I'm giving myself the time that I so desperately needed and still continue to need to heal.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of professionals in this field that I know, and even myself to some extent, kind of went through a similar thing of like doing something tangentially related that wasn't really gonna, like my first jobs for 3 years in the nutrition space, I worked for the city Department of Health on like community nutrition programs and nutrition policy. I was definitely face to face with diet culture in those and didn't even recognize it as such, right? At the time I didn't have that analysis. And so, it was definitely kind of still triggered a lot at the time, but also like I wasn't working directly with eating disorder clients, and I think I needed that time to like get my footing in the nutrition field without the direct client interaction, because I think that would have been too much at that point when I was still going through my own recovery, the early stages. And I think I've heard that from a number of other people too, that they had to kind of do something. I forget who it was. Maybe Nadia Craddock. We were talking about this, about like going into research was sort of a way to, not have to be like dealing directly with clients and the stuff that might stir up. But then eventually I think some people do end up working with clients. I did, and, a number of people I know did, but it's getting that time to like really shore up your own recovery is so hugely important if you are going to do any sort of direct client work. And maybe you won't, maybe you'll just find another niche. But I think that's so great that you're taking the time to figure that out.
Yeah. And something to note is that again, like access to recovery is still an issue for me. So as long as that is still a challenge for me, I don't see how I can successfully become a dietitian. One, I can't afford to take the exam, to be frank. And two, I also can't afford the salary that they pay dietitians. So like
it's way too low.
Exactly. So I very much I think I have a lot more to think about in order to survive. And right now, being a dietitian in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and like self-actualization, I'm not even able to consistently meet my basic needs right now because I am still in my trauma response. I'm still very much in recovery and still struggle with access to food and care that I need. And that is something that is so that access, that barrier to access to healthcare in general, something I'm very passionate about, which is something that I'm seeking out to do through my work on YouTube and talking with you. I ultimately just want to help people gain access in maybe unconventional ways. So like creating courses for folks who need the help and just can't afford it. And that's what I want to do. And so I very much, it feels very like a big conflict in my mind, but in my heart, I know that I am right where I need to be. I know that these wounds will heal with time, and I know that it's okay. I continue to work on accepting that it's okay that I don't know when things are going to happen, how things are going to unfold. I just know that I can do hard things, and ultimately I get to decide what I do with my life. Obviously within the realms of my privilege, but what I mean is like I get to steer the steering wheel for all intents and purposes of my life. And I'm really just working on being okay with where I am and really surrendering to that need for control. And that's ultimately very true in my eating disorder recovery, but also in my life in general as things unfold politically. And we want answers, we want accountability, we want justice. And of course I want that. But I think right now I'm in a period of grief. I'm grieving the body that I know I will never have. I'm grieving the privilege that I no longer have, and for the foreseeable future, or right now at least, I do not have. And I am grieving the A lot of parts, a lot of younger parts of myself. And this is the work. And I know in my heart, this is the work that I need to be doing. And so as much as I can, as hard as it is, I need to sit in it. I need to sit in the discomfort because I ultimately deserve it. And it would be an injustice to myself if I didn't.
That is so beautifully said. And I think sitting in the discomfort is like the whole thing, right? It's so what recovery is all about, and healing from all kinds of mental health issues, or working toward healing is about sitting with that discomfort and the not knowing, and radical acceptance, learning to trust that you're where you need to be and that you're okay.
Yeah. The truth is, we know the alternative. The alternative is dieting. The alternative is rigidity, is obsessively controlling things that are not meant to be controlled, and ultimately living with those consequences. I know what the alternative is. So it's almost like I'm at a place of desperation. Sometimes it feels like desperation. Other days it feels like hope, where like I hope for better days. But in reality, it's like I have already. It's really being able to surrender, and the awareness that I have is really a gift for me, and that's something that I know I would not have had if I didn't take time.
I think this is so powerful for anyone who is in it right now to hear. And thank you so much for sharing your story. This has really been a pleasure. Can you tell people where they can find you online and learn more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christy, for having me. It's such an honor. It's something it's something that I've been looking forward to for months. Yeah. So you right now online, you can find my YouTube channel where I share messages just like this. And I'm also going to start talking about entrepreneurship and kind of the segue into my journey. And that's my YouTube channel is called Dishin' with Daph. That's also the handle where you can find kind of my anti-diet and eating disorder recovery handle. But if you do want to support my business or are currently looking for help related to tech, if you have a message just like this and others related to anti-diet and want to pre-package it and share it with the world, my company that I co-run with my partner, Double Vision Media, is here to help.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you have a website for that too? A separate website or?
That's coming soon, but we do have an Instagram handle. It's just doublevision.media. That's actually going to be our website as well. By the time this airs, that actually should be live. So it's doublevision.media.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We'll put links to that in the show notes, and for your YouTube videos and media company as well. It's so exciting.
Yeah. Christy, this is it's such an honor to chat with you. I could talk to you all day.
Yeah, you too. It's been great. And thank you again so much for being here. This is really lovely.
Of course.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Daph Levy for joining us on this episode. And thanks to you for listening. If you want some help healing your relationship with food, you can get support from me for free by going to christyharrison.com/strategies. There you can sign up for my email list and get my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, whatever that may be. You can see lots of different platforms to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/271. That's christyharrison.com/271. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. That's christyharrison.com/book. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasic, and our transcriptionist, Mycroft Holmes, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.